Okay, let's dive in. Something feels different in the U.S.-China relationship lately, doesn't it?
It really does. We've spent so long talking tariffs, trade wars.
Exactly. All those headlines. But now it seems like it's shifting.
Hmm.
So the big question we want to unpack today is, what happens when these economic fights start spilling over into, well, traditional security, military stuff?
Yeah, that's the crux of it. If you want to get a handle on the global picture right now, understanding this potential shift is, I think, pretty vital.
It seems to be evolving quickly, too.
It does. We're seeing this situation where economic competition is increasingly being framed almost through a military strategy lens, geopolitics.
For sure. So to get a clearer view, we've been digging into a recent analysis. It really tries to pull apart the current dynamics, U.S.-China.
Everything from military moves to economic plans and how other countries are reacting.
Right. This isn't just about, the latest news flash. It's about trying to grasp the underlying changes.
Exactly. The goal isn't just listing events. It's understanding how these pieces fit together, what the bigger picture might actually be.
So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to explore why some analysts are now arguing that the Trump administration might be using these traditional security threats against China.
Like military posturing.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
Using that as a lever, maybe, to influence the U.S. financial market.
Which sounds a bit odd on the surface, right? Military threats to move the stock market.
It does. But let's see what the analysis suggests, see if we can figure out the logic they're proposing.
Okay. It might make more sense if you connect it to, well, broader strategies. Economic leverage, shaping global influence. Perhaps there's a logic there, as the analysis argues.
Okay, so the first big thing this analysis points out is this apparent shift, moving away from what they call non-traditional security like trade.
Peter Navarro territory.
Right. Seeing less of him, maybe more of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. But perhaps even more striking are these warnings coming from military figures. Admiral Schembri, for instance.
That change in who's talking and what they're emphasizing is quite telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Less focus on trade, more talk about military readiness. It could signal a pivot in the main tools the U.S. is using or thinking of using with China.
And Schembri's recent comments to Congress were, well, pretty dramatic.
Understatement.
He talked about a rapidly rising risk of conflict, Western Pacific, potential for huge global economic disruption, even the possibility of nuclear escalation if things really go sideways.
Those are incredibly serious warnings, especially coming from the Indo-Pacific Command Chief.
He also stressed how costly a U.S. win would be and the danger of losing dominance if the U.S. failed. And he was crystal clear. China is seen as the only major challenger to U.S. power in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, the language is stark. Nuclear escalation, severe economic fallout, even in victory. It shows how high the U.S. military sees the stakes. And framing China as the sole challenger is key to their strategic thinking.
So the analysis suggests the point isn't just the threat itself, but maybe the use of that threat?
That seems to be the core argument, using that fear, perhaps, to try and redirect financial flows, maybe back towards the perceived safety of U.S. assets.
So this period of tension we've been in, it started with trade friction, tariffs.
Right.
And now the argument is it's spilled over. It's not just about economics anymore. It's about the potential for actual military conflict.
Exactly. It seems like that initial phase, the tariff approach, maybe hit a wall in terms of effectiveness. So now, perhaps, they're reaching for a different tool, traditional security threats.
Okay, let's dig into that tariff war failure idea a bit more.
Yeah.
The analysis we're looking at argues it just didn't really work as intended. And apparently it led to quite a bit of instability in the U.S. financial market. They talk about soaring U.S. Treasury yields.
Which basically means it got more expensive for the U.S. government to borrow money, a sign of nervousness in the bond market.
Right. And there are even whispers, according to the analysis, that internal U.S. factors like certain capital interests are playing a role in that turbulence.
That assessment, that the tariff war fell short, lines up with a lot of economic commentary. The big goals, like shrinking the trade deficit massively or forcing major concessions, didn't really happen.
And the resulting market volatility.
And hints of internal pressures making it worse. Yeah, it really shows how complex these big economic moves can be. Unintended consequences.
This brings up a fascinating historical parallel. They mentioned something called the Tumu crisis.
Ah, yes. Linked to Director Xu Beilong's warning about Hong Kong being vulnerable.
Right. For those not familiar, the Tumu crisis was basically about a major internal vulnerability being exposed. The analysis hints the U.S. might be facing its own kind of internal fragility, amplified by the tensions with China.
It's a potent analogy, isn't it? Internal weaknesses exposed by external pressure. Xia Beilong's Hong Kong warning highlights that security stability link, and the analysis draws a parallel. Maybe U.S. internal capital interests were part of that financial market instability.
And it goes further. It suggests that after China pushed back hard in the trade war, and the U.S. apparently secretly waived some tariffs.
Which is still a bit murky, the details on that.
True, but the perception grew within the U.S. financial world that China was actually starting to kind of guide expectations, set the tone.
Which implies a real shift in power dynamics, or at least perceived power. If the financial markets start looking to Beijing for cues, that's significant.
It suggests the U.S. counterpunches weren't landing, or were even backfiring, maybe.
Possibly. Or that China's response was more effective than anticipated, leading to this reassessment in the U.S. financial community.
And this ties right into concerns reportedly voiced by former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Worries about investors questioning how safe U.S. Treasury bonds really are. A potential loss of confidence in U.S. economic policy overall.
That's serious stuff. Yellen worrying about confidence in treasuries.
Yeah, it sounds like it could really undermine the foundation, the perceived bedrock safety of the U.S. economy.
If confidence in treasuries wobbles, that has huge global ripple effects. They're seen as the safe asset. So yeah, her reported concerns would highlight potentially deep long-term consequences.
Okay, so here's where the analysis takes that really interesting, maybe controversial turn.
Right.
It connects Admiral Chembry's stark warnings directly back to this idea. The Trump administration's alleged desire to regain what they call the dominant right to guide the U.S. financial market.
Explain that phrase a bit more. Dominant right to guide.
It basically refers to the U.S.'s historical power to shape how global investors see risk and reward. You know, because the dollar is dominant, the U.S. economy was seen as incredibly stable.
Okay, so setting the narrative for global finance.
Exactly. And the theory here is by creating this atmosphere of war or instability focused on China.
You scare investors.
Maybe. Or you counter China's growing influence on those market expectations. You try to slow down that erosion of confidence in the U.S., make the U.S. look like the safer haven again, despite its own issues.
So this is the core argument. The tough military talk isn't just about military readiness. It's also a calculated move to reassert control over how financial markets perceive things.
Make China look like the bigger risk.
Potentially. Project China is this huge, imminent threat, influence investor psychology, and reestablish U.S. dominance in shaping those financial narratives.
And this dominant right, it's framed as part of U.S. soft power, its remaining financial clout. But then the analysis throws in Vietnam, suggesting Vietnam has kind of reassessed things and now sees U.S. global power as further declining.
That's a significant observation, if true. Vietnam recognizing declining U.S. hegemony.
Especially from a key player in Southeast Asia. It suggests this isn't just an internal U.S. perception issue.
Right. If a country like Vietnam, which has always been cautious with China, starts publicly signaling that U.S. influence is waning, it points to a potentially wider trend. A global reevaluation.
And this potentially feeds back into that financial market confidence issue, right? If major players see U.S. hegemony fading.
It absolutely could. It reinforces the narrative that might be spooking some investors about long-term U.S. stability and dominance.
Which brings us to Vietnam's choices and, consequently, the focus shifting towards the Philippines. Apparently, there was a China-Vietnam joint statement. It emphasized cooperation on the South China Sea, working towards a code of conduct.
Which is interesting, given their historical disputes there.
Very. And the analysis sees this as a bit of a blow to the U.S. because Vietnam was often seen as a potential counterweight, an anti-China model in the region.
So Vietnam prioritizing cooperation with China over maybe alignment with the U.S. strategy.
That's how it's interpreted here. It suggests Vietnam is putting regional stability and economic ties first, which potentially weakens the U.S. effort to build that regional coalition against China's influence.
Makes sense. The analysis argues Vietnam decided prioritizing economic interests with China looked like the better bet, especially after the tariff war seemed to fizzle.
And there are potential upsides for them, like the China-Vietnam Railway project.
Infrastructure, trade, concrete benefits.
So with Vietnam leaning more towards cooperation with China, the analysis argues the Philippines becomes even more central to U.S. policy in the South China Sea. Maybe the main anchor point left.
It definitely raises the stakes for the Philippines' strategic importance to the U.S. there.
And the implication could be a much stronger, more forceful U.S. reaction if anything happens involving the Philippines.
Possibly. The U.S. might feel its credibility in the region is even more on the line if the Philippines is threatened.
Okay, let's shift to some of the military moves mentioned. We saw the U.S. Navy deploy the Nimitz carrier strike group to the Western Pacific.
300 power projection.
Right. And China's PLA monitored it, which is also pretty standard these days.
Tit for tat.
But then there's this rumor, and the analysis stresses it's unconfirmed, about the U.S. Truman aircraft carrier being severely damaged.
Ooh, that's significant if true. Where did that rumor come from?
The analysis doesn't specify the source, just mentions it's circulating. But the point it makes is, if that rumor is true...
It raises big questions about the U.S. fleet's readiness.
Exactly. Combine that potential vulnerability with the financial market jitters we talked about and the perceived weakness from the tariff war.
And it paints a picture of potentially strained U.S. power. It could definitely feed into that reassessment of U.S. strength we were discussing.
It could contribute to what the analysis calls the spontaneous adjustment of expectations in the U.S. financial market.
A rather clinical term for market nervousness.
Right. Now, the analysis then looks at China's countermoves, saying they go beyond just military shadowing.
Okay.
It mentions a social media post by Trump claiming China abandoned a huge Boeing order.
Right, I remember that.
But the analysis presents a counter-narrative. It suggests China is actually telling its airlines, suspend Boeing deliveries, stop buying U.S. parts.
Which is a different level of action. Not just canceling an order, but actively halting deliveries and supply chains.
And the implication is that their own plane, the COMAC C919, is becoming viable, maybe even getting close to engine self-sufficiency.
That's a huge development if the C919 is truly ready for prime time, and especially if they crack the engine problem. That's always been the Achilles heel for their aerospace ambitions.
So this Boeing situation becomes a perfect example of how economics and strategy are tangled up.
Absolutely. China shifting from Boeing isn't just about planes. It shows they're using their massive market as leverage, maybe responding to U.S. pressure. And it signals progress in their own high-tech industries.
And the potential fallout for Boeing could be enormous, couldn't it?
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
It's not just lost commercial sales.
Because Boeing is also massive in U.S. defense manufacturing.
Exactly. It's integral to the U.S. defense industrial base. So a major hit to Boeing's market share becomes a strategic concern for the U.S., not just an economic one.
Plus, the analysis brings up past safety issues, like the Ethiopian Airlines crash.
Right, the 737 MAX issues.
Suggesting other countries might see China's move and think, maybe we should diversify our suppliers too. It could create a snowball effect.
That reputational damage definitely lingers. It could make other buyers more open to alternatives like Airbus or maybe even COMAC down the line.
So China pulling back from Boeing isn't just a trade spat. It hits U.S. manufacturing, services, maybe even financial stability if Boeing struggles significantly. The analysis uses this phrase, complex Western capital transfer. Kind of jargony, but I think it means the complicated web of money flowing between the U.S. and Europe.
Right. Investments, supply chains, financial ties.
And the argument is China's move against Boeing throws a wrench into that system. It injects variables, stirs up tensions maybe within the U.S. and also potentially between the U.S. and Europe.
Pitting allies against each other, potentially, if Europe's Airbus benefits significantly.
That seemed to be the implication. It's presented as a much broader strategic play than just sticking it to Boeing.
Fascinating. It's not just reacting, but actively trying to reshape the flows of global capital and industry.
That's the picture painted. And then there's this detail. Vietnam apparently gave the C919 its airworthiness certificate.
Okay, that is interesting. A non-Chinese regulator giving it the okay.
It suggests growing international acceptance of China's aviation tech. And it opens up possibilities for using the renminbi more internationally.
Cool.
Well, imagine Vietnam, or others, wanting to buy C919s. They might take out loans from Chinese banks in renminbi to finance the purchase.
Ah, I see. So the plane sales drive the use of the currency, contributing to RMB internationalization.
Exactly. And the analysis frames China's broader strategy here as befriend the distant and attack the near.
A classic strategy. Who's distant and who's near here?
Airbus in Europe is distant. Maybe they benefit if Boeing loses orders. The U.S. and Boeing are the near target being pressured.
Okay.
Yeah.
Clever, if that's the play.
And another layer, China's control over rare earth metals.
Crucial for high-tech manufacturing.
Right. The analysis highlights this as another point of leverage, making the remaining U.S. manufacturing base potentially vulnerable if China tightens those supplies, especially in response to something like the Boeing restrictions.
So it's a multi-pronged approach: market access, technological development, currency internationalization, critical materials.
Yeah. And the analysis stresses these restrictions have often been gradual, tit for tat. But this apparent full rejection of Boeing signals something more decisive, maybe.
A shift in posture.
Perhaps linked to confidence in their own tech, the Yun-20 military transport engine, the C999, the planned C929 wide-body.
They use an analogy, right? Supercomputers and shield machines.
Yeah, basically saying China learned from areas where they were cut off before. Now they aim to break that dependence completely in aviation, and crucially, capture the long-term money from servicing and maintaining these complex machines.
Right. It's not just the upfront sale, it's the decades of maintenance revenue. That's where the real long-term profit is.
And they contrast China's ability to enforce these kinds of measures with what they call weaknesses in the U.S. customs system,
Meaning?
suggesting that while U.S. goods might face real hurdles getting into China, Chinese goods still find ways into the U.S. market relatively easily. An asymmetry.
Implying China's trade restrictions might have more bite than U.S. ones.
That seems to be the suggestion. Okay, shifting slightly again. The analysis looks at how others are preparing for, well, whatever comes next.
Right.
It notes Japan seems to be taking a careful, maybe independent line in upcoming tariff talks, not necessarily jumping into a firm U.S. anti-China alliance.
Prioritizing their own economic interests, perhaps? Hedging their bets?
Could be. And it mentions this fisherman's mentality.
We have that.
Countries like in Europe, maybe Russia, Japan,
Yeah.
basically watching the U.S. and China clash and looking for opportunities to benefit from the fallout.
The old saying, when tigers fight, the clever monkey waits in the tree. Or in this case, the fisherman waits by the shore.
Something like that. Meanwhile, China's strategy, according to this analysis, is all about making worst-case scenario preparations.
Preparing for the worst, hoping for the best.
Kind of. Focusing on strengthening their domestic economy, what they call minimum economic internal circulation, making it more resilient, and upgrading it.
And the evidence for this.
The Chinese leaders' visits to ASEAN countries, pushing projects like the Trans-Asian Railway, building ties, building infrastructure.
And ASEAN is a huge market, right?
Exactly, especially for things like planes and ships, which are central to these tech rivalries. Okay, so all this leads the analysis towards suggesting, well, a potential showdown is coming.
That sounds ominous.
It does. It speculates that different factions in the U.S., the Biden camp, the Trump camp, maybe even European interests, might start prioritizing their own specific interests over a unified U.S. national strategy, especially if the U.S. position looks less favorable.
Internal divisions potentially undermining a coherent response.
And meanwhile, there's this growing belief noted within the U.S. financial market that the renminbi is actually on track to become the dominant global currency eventually.
Wow, that's a big claim circulating in U.S. financial circles.
Apparently so. And the analysis wraps the section up starkly. A showdown between the two golden trumpets of China and the United States may not be far off.
Golden trumpets. Interesting phrase, meaning their economic and financial power.
I think so, yes. Okay, one last piece. Recent military stuff. The analysis mentions a navigation warning from China. Military exercises in the Bohai Sea.
Near Beijing and Tianjin. Sensitive area.
And it's seen as more evidence of this confrontation spilling over, becoming more tangible at the traditional security level.
Actions backing up the rhetoric.
And there's even speculation about China maybe debuting new killer weapons soon. Things like the rumored Type 096 nuclear submarine or maybe directed energy weapons.
In this climate of tension.
Yeah.
Preparing for major events, perhaps.
That's the suggestion. Preparing for the unexpected or signaling readiness.
Okay, quite a complex picture.
It really is. So if we try to boil down the core insights from this analysis we've been discussing,
Before.
it really seems to argue that the Trump administration's louder focus on traditional security threats, the military angle with China, it's not just about defense.
Right.
It's presented as a deliberate tactic,
Yeah.
a way to try and grab back control of the narrative and critically steer expectations in the U.S. financial market.
Especially after the tariff war didn't go as planned and maybe created more instability than leverage.
Exactly. It's about regaining that dominant right to guide the market, countering China's growing influence there.
So the central theme is that deep link, that intertwining of economic power and security moves.
You can't separate them.
No. The analysis argues the tough security talk is being wielded strategically, as an economic tool almost, to shape financial perceptions and push back against China's economic rise.
It really hammers home how interconnected these domains are: economics, security, finance. You can't understand the U.S.-China relationship by looking at just one silo.
Absolutely not. You need to see how they influence each other. Understanding that interplay is just essential if you want to navigate what's happening globally right now.
Which leads us to a final thought, really, for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
Given all these moving parts, the economic friction, the security posturing, the shifting alliances, the market psychology,
Yeah.
what are the long-term consequences likely to be for global economic stability, for the balance of power?
Big questions.
Huge questions. What specific things should you be watching for as this continues to play out? It certainly feels like a moment of major global flux.
It does. And that connection between the economy and security seems like it's only going to become more critical to track.
Definitely something to keep digging into. Consider the different angles.